Welcome to the second episode of Elasmocast. I'm here with a special guest, Wayne Itano. Wayne, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background?
All right. I'm an avocational paleontologist with I'm associated with the University of Colorado Museum of Natural History in Boulder, Colorado, and I'm currently specializing in late Paleozoic chondrichthyans, basically sharks and relatives. Uh, and I got started as well, a fossil collector, basically. When I was a kid, back in Maryland, I collected shark fossils, shark teeth mainly. And after I moved out to Colorado, after getting my doctorate in physics, I found that there were fossils all around here, like ammonites and such. Started collecting them, and then I made an unusual find of a it's called Sulcacanthus shark spine from the Pennsylvanian in the mountains of Colorado, and in pursuing this and finding out everything I could about these chondrichthyans, I just got more and more interested in this particular kind of fossil and got to the point where I was able to publish on my own and so on.
hmm And what we're going to be talking about, especially today, is a discovery that you published this year. And I think that it's really fascinating because I love learning about these long ghost lineages that happen within chondrichthyans and within animals as a whole. I find them really fascinating. So, Wayne, why don't you walk us through what you discovered? Because I think that it's, again, really intriguing.
Oh, when you talk about this recent discovery on the possible relative of Squaloraja, an obscure Jurassic shark-like fish from the Mississippian of Indiana. And as I said, I'm associated with a museum of natural history here in Boulder, Colorado. And before I got to hmm, oh, okay. Or I want to acknowledge my colleagues, Chris Duffin from England, who co-authored the paper and is an expert on Squaloraja. And in fact, I think he's just about the only one to publish new material on that fish in the last 50 years or so. And Robert Schoch from Indiana, who actually found the Mississippian specimens that I'm interpreting. Okay, well, Squaloraja was discovered by the famous Mary Anning, who's also famous for many other discoveries in the early Jurassic, Lyme Regis, England. And on the left there is an illustration of the fossil he found, and it's okay. So it's facing left. That's the skull there, and the spinal cord is on the right. And I'd like to draw your attention to this area here. Now, she thought that this funny pair of projections here were the jaws. That would be very unusual because we're looking at the top of the skull, and that upper one is the one that's hinged. So that would be a really strange jaw if it were that. Now, in fact, that's not a jaw. That upper projection is something called a frontal clasper. This is a reconstruction of Squaloraja. It's got a flattened body. It was once thought to be intermediate between sharks and rays. In fact, it's something different called a holocephalin. But this funny thing here is called a frontal clasper, and it's used in the mating behavior of these kinds of fishes and is only on the male. Now, this is a modern holocephalin, commonly called a ratfish. This one's a spotted ratfish. And you see here, that little thing there is the frontal clasper of a modern ratfish. And a little closer look, you see it there. It's got these prickly kind of denticles on there, and it's, as I said, is used in some sort of mating behavior and is present only on the male. Now, here's a fossil skull of Squaloraja looking from the top, and we see, oops, here the frontal clasper, that long thing, resting in a groove on a cartilage called the median rostral cartilage. And that rostral cartilage, here's another example without that frontal clasper resting in it. You're looking at the upper or dorsal side. It's got this hollow groove down there where the frontal clasper rests. And here is the fossil from the St. Louis Formation of Indiana. It's about 337 million years old, or more than 130 million years older than Squaloraja. But you see a very similar kind of groove there, and these narrow edges out there. Also various denticles on the outside. And this is the holotype of a new genus and species, Sulcacanthus, schachti, Itano, and Duffin. And this is a possible matching frontal clasper from the same fossil bed in Indiana. We're, I think, looking at the lower or ventral side. These concave areas on the side are probably the muscle attachments for the frontal clasper, which will allow it to move. But while that previous median cartilage, this thing is very distinctive, and these two look very similar to each other, and there's nothing else in the fossil record that's much like either one of them. This one over here is slightly less distinctive. While it could be a Squalorajoid, it's also not so different from a few other kinds of holocephalin frontal claspers called the Myriacanthoids. Here's a cladogram of the holocephalins, and we have things like Helotus down at the base, but due to its combination of primitive and derived characters, it's the Squalorajidae family is placed at this point. Modern holocephalins or chimeroids are out here. Here are the Myriacanthoids. And this places the first Squalorajoids or Squalorajoids at least 330 million years ago, because there's a proto-chimerid just recently discovered from Russia that's 330 million years old, which means that this node here has to be at least 330 million years ago, and the node leading to Squaloraja has to be even older. So this means that we have a gap here, a ghost lineage, if you like, from the basal Squalorajoid to Squaloraja itself of at least 130 million years old. But this new fossil that was found fits in this picture. There should be Squalorajoids around there from the Mississippian, and this looks very much like one. So I think that's okay. The end of my slides. We can go on with questions, and I guess I can stop sharing my screen here.
So,
okay.
So let me ask, what usually causes ghost lineages like that in the fossil record? Like, why is there usually some sort of disparity that we find amongst fossils?
Well, I'm not sure there's a single answer to that. Some people might have ideas. It's kind of like asking why are there living fossils, for example, and I don't know if there's a single reason. Sometimes I think things are accidents, but there are a number of these long ghost lineages, and including many of them in the fish. Like consider the coelacanth. I mean, it had a low diversity for a long time, and then you come along to the end of the Cretaceous and they disappear from the fossil record, but they must have been around and then are found in the present 65 million years later. In fact, there's a term for this kind of a lineage I learned recently. They're called depauperons. A depauperon is a lineage with a low number of species, a low diversity for a very long period, like 100 million years. And among the fish, you've got the lungfish, very long lineage, but very low diversity over very long periods. And also some things like gars or sturgeons and such. But it honestly seems to me like a bit of an accident, but I don't have anything general to say about it.
Mm-hmm. And what type of environments did Squaloraja inhabit?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's found in the Lyme Regis deposits of the early Jurassic, which must have been fairly near shore, marine, and was loaded with other kinds of fish, sharks, marine reptiles, and so on, um, which are found in those deposits. So, yeah, very prolific kind of a near shore marine environment.
And I find that really fascinating too, because from what I've seen, a lot of ghost lineages, they tend to do a lot more with environments like, say, a deep water or pelagic environment. They tend not to preserve as well in the fossil record simply because there just aren't as many sites available to find those fossils. So you have some sort of sample bias. But I find it really fascinating that you'd have a near shore animal like Squaloraja that has such a long ghost lineage. I just find that really intriguing. And it also is at a similar time period where you see diversity in the modern group of sharks, the Sulcacanthus in the early Jurassic. You really see those explode too at that same point.
Well, it could be that the Squaloragids were hiding out in the deep ocean for those 130 million years, and then one of them evolved to like a nearshore environment. Um, it's one of the distinctive things about Squaloraja is this flattened body shape, which seems to be adapted for living on the sea bottom and so on. It could be that its earlier ancestors were deep sea, with the exception of this one that recently found in Indiana, which is also in a very near shore environment. So it could be that just by chance, while the surviving Squalorajoids moved to the deep sea, one of them changed and evolved to become near shore, and then shows up in the fossil record again.
Mm-hmm. So when you first studied the fossil from Indiana, what were some other ideas that came in your head or potential possibilities of it before you wound up landing on it being a Squalorajoid?
Mm-hmm. Well, it looks a little bit like a shark spine, but that long, hollow groove isn't like the groove that's sometimes on the back of a dorsal fin spine. And I mean, so I considered the possibility that it was a dorsal fin spine of a shark. Um, but then looking closer, that groove seemed different, and then there are denticles along the edges, but they kind of point in the opposite direction that the denticles on the back of, say, a hybotis fin spine would. So I started to consider there might be some sort of another kind of spine, say from the dorsal part of a holocephalon, with that groove facing forward, but then looking through the record of holocephalons, I happened on Squaloraja, which I had not paid much attention to before, and it just seemed like a very good match.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of people they tend to study either the Paleozoic stuff or the Mesozoic and then the Cenozoic, but you really don't see very often a bridge between those two, especially when you wouldn't expect
Mm-hmm.
something from the early Jurassic to appear all the way back into the late Paleozoic. That's a pretty big span. You said 130 million years around.
Yeah.
And
Um,
what do you think is like the significance of finding ghost lineages such as that? Like how does that um further our understanding within paleontology as a whole, if that's not too broad of a question?
well, I guess it's a little bit like asking about the significance of living fossils. I mean, they're very, like the Nautilus. It though that doesn't exactly have a ghost lineage, has a very long period with low diversity. Um, they're useful because they give us an insight into how these ancient things really lived. Like the living coelacanth. It's very interesting to look at. But since they kind of went along their way, not evolving too much, they kind of well, they're just kind of freaks. I mean, they didn't participate in the further evolution much because they just kind of kept going as they were going, and didn't participate much in the rest of the evolutionary history. So
Mhm.
I think they give us a lot of information, but they're kind of accidents, I think, you know.
So when you look at an animal like the coelacanth or some other living fossil, did they not evolve much, or did their body morphology just not change as much relative to other organisms?
Uh, well, that varies. I mean, of course, well, we recognize them as living fossils because their morphology um, didn't change much. Um, And in some cases, we can look at their, if we've got the modern ones, we can look at the genomes and maybe verify that it seems to have evolved very slowly. I
Mhm.
think that's the case for some of the chimeroids, the maybe it's Calorhynchus. I'm not sure which one has been sequenced. That it's by looking at the genome, you can see that for some reason it just hasn't evolved as at the same rate as other uh, organisms. Um, and I don't know that they can give a reason why.
Yeah. And I'd say for sharks, the probably the biggest candidate for what people would consider to be a living fossil would be the frilled shark. You often hear of that as a living fossil. And it's true that their teeth haven't changed a ton since they've been discovered in the late Campanian or so, but I think that we're seeing now that even though the teeth morphology is fairly similar, they actually had fairly high diversity rates within the late Cretaceous, which probably signifies them evolving earlier. But again, that those type of ghost lineages are more common because it's a deep water animal by nature. So you don't really have a complete fossil record on them. But because you have so many different fauna, say in Hornby Island, Canada, you have at least a few different genus level um, frill sharks there that they probably had radiated more so than we would have thought, which I find really fascinating. And then going on ghost lineages as well, another Paleozoic one are the cladodontomorphs, which I've talked about briefly, but they have fairly recently found some in the early Cretaceous of France. And apparently those took over. They kind of sought refuge into deep water environments, kind of like what the frill sharks occupy now. But that's kind of how they survived such a long span of time.
Uh, yeah, um, I mean the teeth are shaped much like some Paleozoic cladodonts. The enameloid is more like Neoselacians. I don't know what that means particularly, but yes, so they seem to have taken refuge, if you like, in the deep deep ocean where their fossils aren't often found. But I mean, there is some controversy about that. Not everyone believes that they're really uh, Paleozoic survivors. Uh, but
Hmm.
well, we
Well, what
just
are
have
your
we.
thoughts on them, on the um, early Cretaceous cladodontomorphs that were found in France? Do you believe that there is something else?
Well, it's a little bit of a puzzle about the enameloid structure, which is different, but it's possible that this multi-layered or triple-layered enameloid could have evolved more than once. I don't know. Um, so, lacking any other evidence, I'm inclined to believe they probably are um, Paleozoic survivors. Uh, uh, so they would have been living fossils at that time, if there were anyone to study them.
Hmm. Yeah, and I find it fascinating too, even going back to convergence. If you look at the frilled sharks and then the cladodontomorphs, their teeth are convergently very similar. They both have that lingual protuberance of the root that makes their basal face quite tall, which is why I think a lot of people used to believe um, that frilled sharks were a cladodontomorph, but again with an amyloid and then genomic testing, they found that they are hexanchoforms, so they are true sharks. But that kind of can drive us into a question of with Sulcacanthus, what do you think on that makes it seem more like it is closely related to Squalorajoids rather than just having convergent similarities?
Well, I can't eliminate convergence just with this evidence. Let's say it's so we've just got the morphology, if you like, that is so unusual and so similar to each other that I guess it seems likely. It also fits into the that cladogram picture,
Mm-hmm.
but there's not much more I think we can do until we find more fossils. Um, I'd say that the other experts in the field find it plausible that people who reviewed the paper were Michael Coates from Chicago and Charlie Underwood from England. And I sent the article to Evgeny Popov in Russia, who's probably the authority on Mesozoic to modern holocephalans. And he's inclined to believe it is an early Squalorajoid too.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I guess you have to. So that's about all I can say. It's plausible, and um, but there's not much more I can say beyond the similar morphology. You have to realize, of course, most chondrichthyans, species, genera, and so on are only known from isolated parts, usually teeth. So we can say that the teeth look, fit this lineage or whatever, but if you were to have a whole um, holomorphic fossil, um, maybe you'd see something different, but we have very few of those. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I find it really fascinating. And how closely related were these? I know you touched upon it briefly, but how closely related were the Squalorajoids to the extant chimeriforms?
Well, they're in they're placed in a suborder of their own. Some people think it should be a separate order. So it's a rather distant relationship within the holocephalans. Um, it's Squaloraja has always seemed kind of odd because there's it pops up in this narrow window of the early Jurassic. Um, it's in a family of its own, a suborder of its own, maybe an order of its own. Well, and now maybe with one other species to share it with. Uh,
Mhm.
they they're just so well. One thing that's different is the flattened body shape. They're well, there certainly aren't. This is very rare among the holocephalans to have a dorsoventrally flattened body. But clearly, that's an adapted to being on the sea floor. You could imagine that maybe if some other lineage of holocephalans adapted to that kind of environment, then it might evolve a frontal clasper similar, but to that. So that was a speculation that it could be convergent if it um, another holocephalan had a similar adaptation to living on the seafloor.
Mm.
Um, so it's possible, but even then, there's quite a bit of diversity in these frontal claspers, and they, okay, like I said, there are a couple of muricanthoids that have a somewhat similar lance-like long frontal clasper, but none of them have this uh, cartilage down the rostrum with a groove in it to fit in, other than Squaloraja.
Hmm.
Um, it's just sort of an unusual thing. It would be odd for it to evolve twice the same way. It's not impossible.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. And you see with even, say, extant sharks, animals within the same order evolve that dorsoventrally flattened bodies. Like a prime example of that would be the Wabagong sharks within the Erectolobiforms. And if you broaden out the scope from holocephalans to chondrocephalans, you see some patelodonts that have evolved flattened bodies like Genasa. And I would like to know your thoughts on there's kind of a debate going on between holocephaly and euchondrocephaly. Some people like to place all of these different organisms in holocephaly, whereas some people like to branch it off as euchondrocephaly. And then you have, say, maybe a superorder or infraclass of holocephaly. What are your opinions on those two?
Um, I don't think that there's really enough fossil evidence to really be definitive. So I just I I've started avoiding using euchondrocephali if there's not a good reason for it. You know, there's lots of stuff going on at the base of the crown chondrichthyans, and like where do the eugeniodonts fit in? Where do the pterodonts fit in? And it's not in my scope really to say, I guess. Yeah,
Hmm.
I'd rather just leave it until more fossils are found.
Hmm. Yeah, and I will say that it's probably the most complex field, arguably within Chondrichthyan paleontology, is the farther you go back into the Paleozoic, dealing with stem Chondrichthyans, then the early crown group Chondrichthyans, and where everything kind of fits in. It's really a complex task, especially when you look at tooth bases of some euchondrocephalans that look more closely related to stem not selachins, but euselachins per se, so like hybodonts and predacrodonts. They tend to have fairly similar tooth bases at times. But then where does that fit in with the cladodontomorphs and the diplodonts? It's really a complex task that I think has puzzled paleontologists for a long time.
Yeah, and we're discovering new things. That this is where the answers come from, is new fossils, like all these Tellurian ones from China and so on. And it wasn't so long ago that we didn't really know that acanthodians were stem chondrichthyans. They, some people, well, maybe most people at just 20 years ago or so are grouping them more with the osteichthyans. Um, but you can you can argue forever, but until you find more fossils, I can't
Yeah.
really be sure. Yeah.
So what are your thoughts as to the stem chondrichthyan base compared to what branched out after? Like where do you see everything piecing together there? Say from the early Silurian, and then let's just go onwards throughout the Paleozoic.
Oh, well, you've got all these. various acanthodian lines, which are getting close to crown chondrichthyans, but I think some molecular clock studies show a divergence between the crown elasmobranchs and holocephalans back in the Silurian, but this seems to be another ghost lineage. We don't have identifiable holocephalans before the late Devonian.
Mm-hmm.
But there's just a lot of missing data. And then there are strange things like Ukacampella or whatever that look, well, you just say they look strange. They don't even have tooth files and all that.
Mm-hmm.
There's just a big mess there at the stem that we can't really sort out until we have more fossils. But that's
Mm-hmm.
what we're waiting for.
And where do you see the cladodontomorphs playing in phylogenetically?
Well, I have a feeling that the split between holocephalans, which may be grouped with Cladocoelaci and so on, and the Euselacians may be grouped with cladodontomorphs, goes pretty far deep into the Devonian at least, but with a lot of missing data. Say.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
And what's the reasoning behind the split for cladodontomorphs between, like, say, Tenacanthus and Glickmanius going towards the elasmobranch side compared to, say, Cladocoelaci, which goes towards the holocephalin or the euchondrocephalin side?
well, not everybody puts Cladocoelaci on the holocephalin side. I'm just looking at this thing from Oates, I think, and he has it on the other side. So I think there just is a lot of missing information. Um,
Mm-hmm. Because
there's
I've
no
talked
consensus on that. Yeah.
Yeah. I've talked with other paleontologists, and there really isn't a consensus on it. Like some people say that some of the Simoriforms would be on the Euchondrocephalin side. Some people lump the Cladodontomorphs as more like a stem chondrichthyan type of thing, where the tooth bases kind of push the Euchondrocephalins and say the Eucelachians into one side, but there really isn't a really convincing argument, I think, that says this is for sure where they're placed compared to, another. It seems like
Um,
there's just a lot of conflicting data.
yeah, and given that I'm not spending too much time, worrying about that when I can
Mhm.
look at much smaller areas like, well, well, take the petalodonts. No one really is sure where they fit in, but I can look at a certain genus of petalodonts or a certain family or whatever and just stay within that. So I I try to focus my attention on narrower questions than that.
Mhm.
There are a lot of puzzles, like if the it's holocephalon or holocephalian to um, more elasmobranch kind of uh, things split according to the molecular clock back in the Silurian. We just have a huge amount of missing information there. I mean, you don't know if the molecular clock is right, but it's something. And then
Mm.
I've also been even more puzzled by the fact that we seem to have shark-like denticles or scales back in the Ordovician, with there weren't even, as far as we know, jawed vertebrates. So, I
Mm.
mean, how does that fit in? I,
Although, could that support the claim that um that you had a split in the Silurian if you have denticles dating back farther, because that means that the lineage would have extended farther back, allowing for splits to happen later on?
um, well, that's really sure. It's possible. It's speculative. Who knows? Maybe holocephalians and elasmobranchs came from different lines of acanthodians. I mean, all kinds of things are possible, but we don't have much fossil evidence.
Yeah.
Um, it does seem, though, that somehow sharks before Jaws is kind of odd. When kind of thought that Jaws came with the pachyderms and such, but there is a lot of missing information.
Yeah. And the acanthodians also are incredibly diverse and are in of itself a paraphyletic group because they probably derived into the other chondrichthyans while still themselves living on further. So I wouldn't be surprised that you'd have multiple lineages of acanthodians splitting into different things. And we really just don't know. And then there's also acanthodians that don't have teeth, and if you go back to the Ordovician, say if you had a split between your chondrichthyans and then your other fish back then, that could even be evidence that teeth evolved convergently between the bony vertebrates and the cartilaginous fish.
Yeah, that could happen. I'd be surprised if Jaws evolved convergently. No one's ever suggested that, I think, but um, there, there would be another way around some of these puzzles, I suppose.
Hmm. Because the evolution of teeth is really fascinating as well, and that's something that I think needs more studying done on. And again, the acanthodians kind of they give us a little more insight, but at the same time, they kind of give us more questions than answers in a lot of ways. Because how we have in the Ordovician no evidence of teeth,
Mhm.
but then you have in the Silurian, you have say in Cyanotus, you have those tooth whorls. And then where teeth evolved from the bony fishes, that's just like a completely different lineage. It's really fascinating, and I think that more work needs to be done.
Um, well, yeah, we have all kinds of pieces of the puzzle, yeah, missing, but we're making progress, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's where I really think that the more detailed, narrow work helps in the field, because if you can, say, describe a new species or new occurrence of something, you're just filling in little pieces of the puzzle that make it a lot easier to look at from a bird's eye view when those pieces are filled in than if you didn't have any of that and you're just going purely on these broad level speculative questions.
Well,
Because,
yeah.
because one little discovery can shift an entire viewpoint. Like, for example, with the discovery of Cyanotus, I talk about that a lot because I find it so fascinating that we found a tooth in the early Silurian or tooth whorl, and how
Hmm.
different these type of acanthodian tooth whorls are than to your modern holocephalin tooth plates or your standard shark teeth. They're incredibly different, yet somehow along the way, the tooth plates of the holocephalins evolved, your
Hmm.
shark teeth evolved, your weird dentitions of ray teeth evolved. So how do you think that the holocephalin tooth plates kind of split out from the other tooth designs that
Mhm.
chondrichthyes had before?
Well, I did a paper recently on Syphodus, and I think I see some of the um, transitions in that uh, in that genus. Um, there's been some work done on Helotus, but I think that may be a separate line where tooth files started to merge into tooth plates, because the Helotus now Helotus comes out very basal in the cladogram, but the actual articulated, the good Helotus simplex specimens are from pretty much the upper Carboniferous, very late, Pennsylvanian. So, but we do find some Helotus-like teeth back in the Devonian, and these, but isolated teeth. So I think those could be early helodonts, but the fossil, the Helotus teeth that we see starting to merge into files are much later in the Pennsylvanian. But Syphodus, um, which has been found now in the Upper Devonian, uh, has a number of interesting examples where the tooth files seem to be partially merged into tooth plates, and some others where we see what looks like the resulting tooth plates that are each resulting from a merged tooth file are starting to merge mesially into larger tooth plates. And we see both steps in various Syphodus tooth plates, teeth, and so on. So that's a candidate for some, at least some of the later cochleodonts or whatever, in forming the tooth plates from tooth files. But I have a feeling that this is just one lineage or whatever, and that a similar sort of fusing, uh, likely first tooth files into small tooth plates, then those resulting tooth plates merging into larger tooth plates, could have occurred multiple times in the lineage. We don't have all the fossils, but I think Syphodus is a good case to look at. Oh, I also did a paper a few years earlier on a funny looking uh, call it a tooth plate, though it's a small one, that has that looks like a fused tooth file, still with the bumps in it from separate crowns, but the base is all fused together. It's a cochleodont, I think, and there are other examples that look like uh, it sort of fits into at least a morphological sequence, if not a phylogenetic one, of anterior tooth files of cochleodonts with separate crowns going to a fairly kind of a merged arch-like thing with separate bumps, going to something that looks very similar, basally and otherwise, but completely smooth arch kind of tooth plate, if you like. And this, along with the Helotus examples, I think seems to say that the fusing of teeth into plates could have happened multiple times in lineages.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really fascinating how the holocephalin tooth design really came into being because it's so drastically different than say pretty much anything else within the Chondrichthyan world.
Yeah,
It's just really bizarre.
yeah, even ray teeth like Mylivatus. I mean, these are just kind of derived tooth files. It just happens to be, different um, shape, and they are formed on the inside, emerge and then get drop off the outside. But and it, in some cases, there's just a single tooth file, these bar-like things. But it's just a sort of more simply derived from more standard tooth files. Yeah, I tend to use, some people call them families. I like file because I can remember it
Hmm.
better. They're all in a file.
I prefer the term file too. I feel like it's more direct.
Mhm.
And what were the teeth of Squaloraja like? How
Uh,
do they compare to standard chimeriforms?
well, they're tooth plates. In detail, they're very different with the kind of surface and the kind of striations across them. So that it's very distinctive. And usually you would expect to find at least some tooth plates more in the fossil record if you're finding anything, but they're very small and very fragile. So I think that may work against their being found, but
Mm,
they are quite distinctive. They're sort of shaped like other Bolus-Valian tooth plates, but they're, like I say, thin and fragile.
hmm. Yeah, I'll say one thing about the patelodonts is it's not always fun finding them because they're so thin that getting them out is quite challenging.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
a lot of the holocephalin teeth or the euchondrocephalin as a whole, they tend to have pretty fragile teeth. Here in Arizona, most of what I can find are holocephalins of various sorts. What advice do you have for people that are hunting in the Paleozoic trying to learn how to identify the holocephalin teeth that they find? Because there's really not as much resources for them as there are for your run-of-the-mill shark teeth.
well, you've got that volume of the Handbook of Paleoichthyology by Barbara Stahl, which is a good place to start. But and you've got those um, monographs from the 1800s, Worthen and St. John and all that. And I think you have to kind of start with the old literature like that, realizing that, you know, they didn't, well, they did the best they could, but obviously these gentitions are mostly heterodont, and they could only guess what ones went together with each other.
Mm,
Um, uh, so if you look at all of the old literature, and there's also things from um, Russia and other countries, you you might hope to at least come up with a name for something, maybe not. But unless you've got something pretty complete, it's a little hard to identify at a species level. And the
Mm-hmm.
complete ones are much rarer than the half complete or whatever. I mean, often they may be missing the edge, which can be pretty important. Um, I I'm currently going to be looking at a an odd tooth plate that was found in the Pennsylvania, Colorado, that I think might be a new species of Sandalodus because it's got some unusual striations on one side that don't look like anything I've ever seen, but I'm going to have to go through all the literature and see if anyone has found anything similar
Mm.
um, to it. Yeah.
That sounds exciting. Yeah,
Um,
the holocephalans really do seem a lot more challenging than a lot of the other stuff. And it is in part because they tend to be incomplete. They tend to suffer a lot of abrasion and weathering to the point where it's you really just see the pores on the toothface, but you don't really see much else from that. So you know just enough to say, yeah, this is a holocephalan tooth, but not enough to say anything else from it.
yeah. And and since you don't find them associated, or very rarely do, you could well be naming tooth plates from the upper and lower jaw or front and back, you know, to different genera.
Mhm.
But if so, that's kind of really a hard problem now. But if often you can't even get that far, just because you've got a little bit of a plate there without the edges, and
Mhm.
sometimes people tend to lump them in as being, I don't know, Saphodus or Pelotus, but without good reason. In
Yeah.
fact, in my Saphodus paper, I pointed out that the valid species of, or I thought were valid, of Saphodus, the plates, either some or all of them, show crenulations along the edge. This is a very distinctive kind of thing I haven't seen in other tooth plates. And they were lumping some things in with Saphodus that didn't have those crenulations. But if I restrict it to those with crenulations, I've got a range from the latest Devonian to the end of the Pennsylvanian. Whereas nominal species were going on up into the whether some Devonian ones uh, into the Permian, and so I'm questioning all Saphodus named from the Pennsylvanian and Permian, and most from the Devonian.
Mhm. Yeah. And that's one of the problems with going with the older literature is you can't really take it by just reading it. You have to understand that a lot of it has been somewhat dated. And again, the new discoveries often prove those old hypotheses to be incorrect. I don't know if you've heard of it, but the Lisgotis, Chamatotis, Venistotis complex that was found in some of the jaws from where was it? I think it was Bear Gulch.
It would probably be Bear Gulch. My frustration is that a lot of this isn't published. You
Mm.
just see hints of it in
Yeah,
the
it makes it
papers. Yeah.
challenging.
Yeah.
Like you can read, I think it's in a Grogan and Lund paper, they bring it up, but there's no figures or anything on it, and nothing's really written. So, especially as an amateur paleontologist, it is really difficult being able to distinguish those things because there's no resources that really back it up. And that's
Hmm.
what I find challenging, not coming from academia where I don't have access to all of these specimens that haven't been described, but still trying to pursue what is the most correct and what would be the most up to date in order to come up with my own hypotheses for things. It's just really challenging staying, in the present when a lot of what's in the present
Hmm.
isn't actually published on.
Yeah, well, there aren't really very many people working on this, so the progress is kind of slow. Sometimes I'm surprised there aren't more people working on it because there's plenty of work to do. Um,
Especially in the Paleozoic world.
oh yeah, there are more people working on the Mesozoic and Cenozoic, and I know it's easier to find the specimens, maybe, um, but you're also competing with other people over possibly the same things. So,
Yeah.
uh, uh, and you can't take what you read at face value because you know certain things get stated without proof, and then people have to go back for a decade or two, the 80s and 90s. People were calling, well, what we now call Blickmanius occidentalis. It was originally Cladotus occidentalis. They were calling it Simorium reniforme, um, without going back and looking at the type specimens of Simorium reniforme. And I think the reason for doing that is it it was an articulated, partially preserved shark, so it was more than just the teeth. He had the teeth and some of the body, so I think they liked naming something that was a little better known. But if
Mhm.
Ginter looked at the teeth, then they weren't the same. So
Yeah.
that went out the window. But for many years, they were being called the wrong thing. And then Agassiz is even worse. There's a lot of confusion because it's one of these chondrichthyans with these uh, sort of rectangular bar-like lateral teeth, but there are a lot of those, and they're not necessarily all the same. So for a while, they got lumped in with Campotus, but Ginter wrote a paper recently that split off Campotus as a diagnosable thing, and it's not that common.
Hmm.
Um, and then okay, what we call Lophotus variabilis um, also had some of these bar-like teeth, and they got associated with these um, nearly complete dentitions with like there's dozens or hundreds of teeth and so on from the Pennsylvanian, and they thought the lateral teeth looked kind of alike, so they started calling them Agassizotus. But if you go back and look at the type specimens of Agassizotus and another referred specimen, they're not the same at all. So Chris Duffin is currently working on a paper that's sorting that out
Hmm.
and calling those large dentitions by a new genus name. Uh, so if you're doing anything that might be lumped in with Agassizotus, you might have to wait till that paper comes out, but it could be this year.
Hmm.
Um, but it'll make many of the identifications in the last few decades or whatever obsolete.
Hmm. Yeah, it's really an ever growing and ever evolving field, paleontology. And it's exciting when something that people have long thought for decades wound up being shown to be incorrect. It is exciting. So I'm looking forward to that paper coming out. But yeah, so we're almost out of time on this. I would like to ask you if you could find out anything about any sort of chondrichthyon, what would that discovery be? What would you love to learn about?
Oh, gosh. Well, I think, well, since I've had a project of working on Edestus and similar things, I would like to see a complete skull of Edestus newtoni, or sometimes it's, or Lestrodus newtoni, which had these tooth whorls that were like a semicircle, more or less, but not like helicoprion. I think they were still shed off the side, and I would like to know how that worked, because it may be that some of the Edestus with straighter whorls somehow use them like saws or whatever, but these I can't imagine a true circular saw somehow spinning. You can't spin your jaw, or
Mm,
whatever. I'd like to know how that worked, and I had a guess that maybe um, actually we don't even know for sure that it had them in both the upper and lower, but since it's so much like Edestus, and we do know that Edestus had both upper and lower scissor-like um, things. I had a hypothesis that instead of using them against each other because they couldn't touch each other, that it moved its head up and down to like a slashing sword. Um, but I'd love to see evidence that that hypothesis was right with an articulated head. But I don't really expect things like that to happen in my lifetime.
hmm
Yeah.
Well, we'll have to set up another one of these and talk about Odestus and the Eugenodonts because those are some of the coolest chondrichthyons that have ever evolved.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, it was
Well,
great having you on, Wayne. I appreciate it. Thank you for sharing your knowledge on Sulcacanthus and the Squalorajoids. Take care.
okay. Thanks.